Israel-Palestine, the issue you assume your Jewish friend Pete has an opinion about. And maybe you're right. Maybe Pete does care about the Israel-Palestinian conflict, but maybe he doesn't. Um, for many people, they don't really know about the issue, so they don't really care about it. But this is largely in part because they feel that it's too complicated to get involved with or to get in on. So I want to take you through a little bit of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what it looks like today, how it got started, and address a few common misconceptions about the issue. So to begin, it's important to kind of understand the layout of where this issue is taking place. So Israel and Palestine are located in the Middle East, and they're located on a contentious part of the world, on a hotbed for conflict, especially in the Israel-Palestinian area, because the particular land in that region is extremely important for three central religions across the world. You have Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, which each have some of their most holy sites located in the regions surrounding Israel and Palestine. For Islam, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest site in Islam, and it is located in Jerusalem, which is part of the contested territory between Israel and Palestine. So obviously this area is extremely important to a lot of different people, a lot of different groups of people. There are millions of people across the planet, and even in the Middle East, that practice all three faiths. So it makes sense that these issues would be important to them. And that's kind of historically why the land has mattered so much. But despite ancient feuds between Israelis and Palestinians, most of the more recent conflict that we kind of see today isn't so much based on faith. It's not about what God to worship or what happens to you when you die. It's really a dispute over land and rights to the area and rights to settle and rights to develop the land in the territory that is now Israel and Palestine. Another misconception about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that it's ancient, that it's been going on for thousands of years, and that it's far too late to get involved with now. And while that's sort of true, that there has been conflict going on for thousands of years in this part of the world, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we look at today and that we know today is really only about 100 or so years old, maybe a little bit longer than that, but it's fairly recent, and it's not quite true or not accurate that this Israeli-Palestinian conflict as we know it has been percolating for thousands upon thousands of years. So it's important to address why these groups of people are contesting this land. And I know I said it's a land issue, but why do both people feel that they have a claim to it? Why can't they make an agreement? And that's a little bit about what I want to get into. So I want to first address the concept called Zionism. And Zionism is the idea that Judaism, or practicing the Jewish faith, is not so much just a religion, but it's more of a nationality, an identity that deserves a home and a homeland and a home state and nation. That notion was largely founded by a journalist actually, named Theodor Herzl, who was living in the Austro-Hungarian empire that was ruled by the Habsburgs, and this was in the 1800s. And he lived in a time where people were starting to really get into this nationalistic mindset, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was no exception. In fact, they were one of the frontrunners of nationalist ideology. And so Theodor Herzl did some thinking, and he really wanted Jews to have a solid place to live. He had watched Jews become persecuted his whole life, and he wanted them to be able to assimilate into European culture. But due to his experiences, he realized that he didn't think that Jews would be able to properly assimilate into Europe. So he decided that they needed to migrate somewhere else and form their own state, their own place that they could call home and live in peace and harmony amongst themselves. And this was about the same time that Palestinians formed a sense of national unity too, and a nationalist mindset, much like some Jews, including Herzl. So Palestine was, at the time where Herzl was around, was ruled by the Ottomans. And the Ottomans kind of they allowed this Palestinian territory to exist, and the Palestinians kind of were starting to form their identity. And this was all at the same time. The whole world was kind of experimenting with nationalist mindsets and becoming more less tied to their beliefs and more tied to where they lived in their state and their country. So that kind of nationalist mindset actually led to World War One, and the Ottomans were on the losing side. So that left the control of the area of Palestine up for grabs. And so after the Palestinians were kind of no longer under Ottoman control, they actually moved into the hands of the British. And the British had made a bunch of promises to the Jewish people, saying that they would guarantee them a place to live, a Jewish state, an independent Jewish state. But they were also claiming the land, which is now Israel-Palestine. And so eventually, or they started to let some Jewish migrants into the area. And in the late 1800s, there was already a huge influx of Jewish migrants to Israel-Palestine, to Israel, modern day. And after World War I, when the British had the territory, they continued to allow some Jewish migration. But this led to increased tensions with the native Palestinian population. As you can imagine, there were disputes over settling rights, who had access to the land. The Palestinians felt that they were being encroached upon, but the Israelis felt that this was, they were allowed to migrate here. And so due to this tension, some conflicts arose, and the British decided to curtail Jewish migration to the region. And so this kind of let sit for a little bit, and there was some tension, some malintent. And then that's a couple years later when World War II broke out. And as many of us know, I hope, World War II included the Holocaust, which is one of the most egregious human rights violations in the history of mankind. Over 6 million Jews, along with other groups, were killed in under Nazi Germany. And it presented a huge problem for Jews in Europe as they looked for a new place to feel safe and a new place to call home. So more and more people wanted to emigrate from Europe to Israel, Palestine. And the UN actually made a partition. They divided up the region after World War II and declared that Israel and Palestine could each have their own territory. The Israelis accepted this. They were pretty happy about it. They felt as though they had, won the day, and they were willing to accept the UN's terms. But the Arab countries, which included not only Palestine, but Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, those countries in the area, or the Arab League as they were known, were not happy, and they were not ready to accept the terms of the UN partition. And so they actually they started a war with Israel, which was known as the Arab League and Israeli War. And the Israelis actually won the war. But in doing so, they actually captured a lot more territory, about a third more territory, than they had been given in the UN partition. And they referenced this war as their independence, claiming their own stake of land and finally being able to achieve their own state in a Jewish homeland. But for the people of Palestine and other Arab countries, they reference this as al-Nakba, or the catastrophe, because they lost a lot of land that they would have otherwise had under the UN agreement. So after Israel claimed a lot more land, Egypt still maintained control of the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank was under the control of the Jordanian authorities. And then this, obviously, there was a lot of tensions between the Arab countries and Israel after this, definite unrest in the region, and until 1961, when a second war broke out between the Arab League and the Israelis. And this was known as the Six Days War, because it took only 6 days for the Israelis to defeat the Arab countries. And they took control of the Gaza Strip, which had been Egypt's, and the West Bank, which had been the Jordanians. And after this, the greater Arab League, the community, kind of accepted that Israel was going to have a lot of this land. But the Palestinians, who were kind of more closely positioned to Israel, were not willing to give up so easily. So although the other countries in the Arab League kind of laid to rest the issue, the Palestinians were still very, very hostile and very angry, and not without good cause to the Israelis. Um, and and that was in 1967. So after that, as I said, Israel controlled the West Bank, and several Israelis started to move into the West Bank and into the Gaza Strip. And these settlements are recognized generally by the international community as illegal settlements. But the Israeli government continues to do nothing about this. On the surface, they may deny that they support or fund these settlements, but when you get down to brass tacks, they have been supporting and funneling money into Israeli settlers in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And it's not just Israelis, too. People from all over the world are moving into this area, and it's causing a lot of people. Many settlers from the United States have moved into the West Bank in recent years, and now there's currently upwards of, or approaching 500,000 settlers in the West Bank. And these settlements aren't just tents. They're not settlers in the traditional sense of, carving out a frontier. The people that are living in this part of the world live in nice houses. There are school systems, roads, playgrounds for children, even a university. So the concept of, even though they're internationally illegal, the idea of getting these Israelis and other people to vacate this area, this land, is highly improbable and potentially even impossible. And none of this has been sitting well with the Palestinian people, who in the late 1980s took part in the first Intifada, which is literally translates to shaking off, large revolts and riots and protests against the Israeli government and against Israeli, what they would call an occupation of their own land. For many Palestinians, their daily life is very controlled and regulated. It's difficult for them to move from place to place, and they often have to pass through Israeli checkpoints to get from point A to point B. And their life is the hand of Israel lays heavily upon the people of Palestine. This was kind of put down by the Israeli government, and things kind of tailed off for a little bit. This Israeli-Palestinian conflict is notoriously had its roller coasters, and it goes through many up and downs. In 1993, President Clinton took the Oslo Accords, which were attempts at peace talks between Israel and Palestine, and leaders from both factions were present. And while it seemed for a while that they might reach an agreement and a settlement and have peace in the region, the talks kind of fell through and nothing lasting really came of them. And in 2000, the second Intifada was launched, and it was much more violent than the first one. Thousands of casualties were suffered by both sides, although much more heavily on the side of the Palestinians. And even today, there's continued unrest in the region. Though since the second Intifada was over in the early 2000s, there's been a more lasting peace agreement. It's not uncommon for there to be rocket strikes going both ways from Israel into Palestinian territory and vice versa. And most recently, just last month, there was volleys of rockets were launched both ways. So the region continues to be unstable. And though there are many parts of the area that are extremely safe for those who live there and for tourists, the area continues to be a point of contention for both Arabs, Palestinians, and also just the greater community at large, the greater world community. So now that you know a little bit more about this issue, you might be able to go home and tell your friends about it, and maybe your friend Pete, you can have a conversation with him.